September 17th, 1944. Over the Molucca Sea, the sky smelled of cordite and ozone. Lieutenant Jack Riley, 22, was falling. His P-38 Lightning, the Kansas City Kitty, had been a beautiful machine. Now it was a coffin of burning metal, a plume of black smoke against the impossible, indifferent blue. Falling. He had counted to 10, yanked the ripcord, and felt the violent, life-saving jerk of the silk. Now he just fell. He watched his plane, his kitty, corkscrew into the sea below. He watched the ocean, a vast, wrinkled sheet of turquoise, rush up to meet him. Salt and terror and the coppery taste of his own blood filled his mouth. He was behind enemy lines, deep behind enemy lines, a world away from Kansas. The after-action report is clinical, cold. File number USAEF PAC 448721, stamped confidential. The folder was called Molucca Sortie Losses, Setner 44. The report stated simply, 1 P-38, 42 Bamot 67119, lost to enemy anti-aircraft fire. Pilot, 2nd Lieutenant J. Riley, presumed KIA. Presumed. A word that buries a man in paper before he is buried in earth. But the official record was a lie. A necessary lie designed to protect a secret far more valuable than one pilot's life. Jack Riley did not die that day. Someone found him. Someone pulled him from the surf, half drowned and bleeding, his flight suit in tatters and his face a mask of shock. Someone hid him. The official file ends there, its pages yellowing in a government vault. But another story begins. A story written not in ink, but passed in whispers, in the flicker of a shared glance, in dialects the Japanese Kempeitai could not understand. A story of ghosts. They were called the Bamboo Network, or sometimes the Whispering Wind. Some American intelligence officers years later would try to give it a name, the Philippine Airman Recovery System. But it had no official name, no uniform, no government sanction. It was a phantom organization made of flesh and blood. It was farmers and fishermen, mothers and children, priests and guerrillas. They were the people of the islands caught between the brutal, immediate reality of Japanese occupation and the distant abstract promise of American liberation. The battle for the nearby island of Morotai had just begun, a ferocious Allied push to reclaim a strategic stepping stone to the Philippines itself. The sky was the new front line. Day and night, the air above the Philippine archipelago swarmed with American planes, Liberators, Mitchells, Lightnings. And with American planes came American pilots, falling from the sky like broken birds. Hundreds of them. Each downed airman was a lottery ticket to hell. A death sentence for anyone caught offering so much as a cup of water. A death sentence carried out with a bayonet or a kris, swiftly and without trial. A public death, a spectacle of cruelty designed to terrorize. They whispered of entire villages erased for the crime of compassion. Yet they did it. In the face of certain death, they did it. Why? The official histories of the Pacific War, thick volumes bound in leather, focus on generals and admirals, on island-hopping campaigns and grand naval battles. They mention MacArthur's return. They detail the tonnage of bombs dropped on Manila. They chart the sinking of the Musashi. But they don't mention Maria Reyes, a 70-year-old woman from a nameless village on Mindanao, who stared down a Japanese patrol commander, her eyes like chips of flint, and swore the feverish American in her hut was her dying son. They don't mention 13-year-old Mateo, who guided a pilot through 3 days of dense jungle using bird calls he'd practiced since childhood to signal for danger. 3 days walking, 3 days hiding, 3 days of silent terror. They don't mention the price. The price was always steep. The price was a village burned to the waterline. The price was a family forced to dig their own graves. The price was a secret kept until death, a story that died on the lips of the brave. The evidence for these acts of courage is not found in military archives in Washington, D.C. Not easily, anyway. It's not in neat, typewritten reports signed in triplicate. It exists in fragments, in whispers, in the margins of history. Scraps of paper hidden for decades inside a family Bible. A faded photograph of a Filipino family standing next to a grinning, lanky American who, according to the War Department, had been dead for 6 months. A single line in a long-forgotten missionary's diary. The Skyman is safe for one more night. God help us all. A third-hand story told by a grandchild about a pilot they called Joe who hid in a cave for 3 weeks, fed on rice and fish and hope. Rumors. They were always just rumors. Nobody in the official chain of command wanted to acknowledge it, but the evidence was overwhelming if you knew how and where to look. Maybe from the MGU, the Miscellaneous Group Unit reports. Maybe from the command trips. Maybe from the debriefs of the few who made it back, their accounts sanitized for security. Maybe in the memories of the very old, their voices thin as paper, their stories a final, desperate attempt to make the world remember. The search for these stories is a race against time, a race against forgetting. This investigation pieces together those fragments. For years, these stories were scattered, dismissed as wartime folklore lost in the grander, noisier narrative of the war. But the patterns are undeniable. The coincidences are too frequent. While the official focus of Operation Tradewind centered on the massive military effort to secure the airstrips on Morotai, a different, quieter war was being fought. It was fought in the shadows of the jungles and in the flickering lamplight of nipa huts across the Philippines and the surrounding islands. A war of compassion against mechanized cruelty. A war of immense personal risk against strategic indifference. A war of ordinary people who, when faced with an extraordinary choice between safety and humanity, refused to look away. This is the story of the downed pilots who were swallowed by the jungle, and the villagers who risked utter annihilation to spit them back out. This is the story of the ghosts who came home. This is the story of how they were saved, and who paid the price. September 15th, 1944, the waters off Morotai Island. It was a place that existed only on Admiralty charts, a forgotten comma in the long sentence of the Dutch East Indies. A ghost. A green malarial smear north of the real prize, Halmahera. No one wanted Morotai, until General MacArthur wanted it more than anything else in the world. The plan was called Tradewind, a neat, tidy name for a brutal calculation. The folder in the archives, brittle and yellowed, states the objective simply: to seize and occupy Morotai Island for the establishment of air facilities and a light naval base. Air facilities. That was the key. Always the airfields. The target was the Philippines. Halmahera, with its 70,000 Japanese defenders, was a fortress, a meat grinder. So they looked next door. They looked at the ghost. Morotai. 2,700 square kilometers of jungle, swamp, and mountain. MacArthur's intelligence, the whispers from the G2 section, said it was empty. Almost empty. A few hundred men. Maybe 500. A token force left to rot by the 17th Army on Halmahera. The invasion force was immense. 84,000 men of the Eastern Corps under Major General Charles P. Hall. An armada of cruisers, destroyers, landing craft. A sledgehammer to crack a nut, or so they thought. The landing was a spectacle of silence. H-hour. Pito Bay. The landing craft grated on the white sand. Ramps slammed down. Men of the 31st Infantry Division, the Dixie Division, poured out, rifles ready. They waited. For the rattle of a Nambu machine gun. For the crump of a knee mortar. Nothing. The jungle just watched. It was too easy. Far too easy. Some said it was a trap. Others said it was a gift. The truth was somewhere in the humid, buzzing air between. The Japanese were there. Not 500. The reports were wrong. Colonel Yasushi Auchi commanded the 2nd Provisional Raiding Unit. Maybe 250 men. Scattered. Isolated. They watched the metal tide come in. They sent frantic messages to Halmahera. They melted into the jungle. And then the main thing started. Halmahera answered. The orders were absolute. Retake Morotai at all costs. But how? The Americans owned the sea. They owned the sky. PT boats, swift and deadly, prowled the strait between the islands. Destroyers like gray sharks circled endlessly. The Americans had built a cage of steel and fire around their new prize. The reports from Japanese patrols were grim. They spoke of searchlights sweeping the water, of radar that could see in the dark, of endless patrols. Schneider, Becker, Wagner, Kaufmann, Kleine, Gross. The names on the American ship rosters were a litany of doom for any Japanese barge captain. They came anyway. They came by night, in plywood barges, in fishing boats, in dugout canoes. Colonel Uchi's small force was being fed, man by man, into the fight. The Second Army sent the 211th and 212th Infantry Regiments. Men who had trained for grand battles, now paddling across a dark channel under the cold eyes of American destroyers. Many didn't make it. The sea took them, the PT boats took them, but some did. Enough to make the jungle bleed. American progress was measured in yards. The engineers worked miracles. The 827th Engineer Aviation Battalion, the 1874th. They were called Seabees. They tore a gash in the jungle near Patoy. They laid down crushed coral and steel matting. The first airfield, Wama, was operational in 2 days. 2 days. The second, the larger Patoy field, was a city of machines. Bulldozers, graders, rollers. Their engines were a constant roar that drowned out the jungle. The airfields were the heart of the operation, the reason for all of it. They had to be protected. The Japanese counterattacks were desperate, suicidal. They'd emerge from the jungle emaciated and feverish, screaming, "Banzai!" They'd run straight into the machine guns of the 124th Infantry Regiment. The American artillery was a god of thunder. The 167th Field. Artillery Battalion's 155mm howitzers could reach deep into the island, turning Japanese assembly areas into craters and splintered trees. A single shell. A flash. And then silence. But the real enemy for the Japanese wasn't just the Americans. It was Morotai itself. The island was fighting them. The sketches found in a captured officer's diary show it. Not sketches of battle plans, sketches of suffering. A soldier with his skin yellowed by malaria. A foot swollen with jungle rot. A list scribbled in the margins. Dysentery, beriberi, scrub typhus. The supply lines were a fantasy. Men were eating roots, leaves, insects. They were ghosts long before American bullets found them. Ghosts in a jungle that was trying to digest them. By October, the main fighting was over. The perimeter was secure. The Japanese were no longer a cohesive force. They were pockets of starving, sick men hiding in the mountains, hunted by patrols. The file TRW 44 Final contains a map, a thick red line drawn around the Doriba Plain. Inside that line, American territory. Outside, the wild, the unknown, the Japanese remnants. The battle for the island was over, but the war from the island was just beginning. The airfields were complete. P-38 Lightnings and B-24 Liberators lined the runways. From Morotai, they could reach the Philippines. They could reach Borneo. They could reach everything. The sky over the Molucca Sea, once a quiet highway of clouds, became a battlefield. The frequency of air combat spiked. Daily, hourly, and with every dogfight, with every bombing run, the odds shortened. For every 10 planes that went out, maybe one wouldn't come back. For every 100 men who took off into the sunrise, some were destined to fall. That's how it began. The island was won, and the sky began to fill with ghosts. January 3rd, 1943, the mountains of Panay. The Japanese Imperial Army believed they had conquered the Philippines. They held the cities. They controlled the ports. Their flags flew over Manila, Cebu, Davao. A victory declared. A war won. They were wrong. Deep in the jungle, another war was being fought. A silent war. A war of whispers and shadows, fought not with tanks and battleships, but with loyalty and courage. It was a war waged by ordinary people. Farmers with bolos, fishermen with nets, school teachers with forbidden knowledge. They had a name for their communication network, a name spoken only in hushed tones: the bamboo telegraph. It had no wires, no operators, no central office. It was a living, breathing network of farmers and fishermen, of village elders and young children, a chain of human courage stretching from the northern tip of Luzon to the southernmost shores of Mindanao. A rumor in a marketplace in Batangas could become verified intelligence at a guerrilla outpost in Leyte within days. A message passed from a laundry woman to a cart driver, from a priest to a market vendor, from a child playing in the dust to a guerrilla runner fading into the jungle. It was invisible. It was everywhere. And it was saving American lives. Thousands of them. The report was designated E&E Report PH 1138, Evasion and Escape. It tells the story of Lieutenant David Foster, 24, from Columbus, Ohio. On December 12, 1942, his B-25 Mitchell, the Buckeye Bell, was shot to pieces over the Visayan Sea. He bailed out. He landed in a canopy of unfamiliar green. Alone. Wounded. Certain to be captured. He was found by a boy named Mateo. No last name in the report. Just Mateo. The boy was 7. He was looking for edible ferns. Instead, he found a giant with white skin and blue eyes, bleeding under a lawn tree. The boy did not run. He did not scream. He simply watched. Then he vanished back into the jungle. An hour later, they came. Not Japanese soldiers. Villagers. Old men with weathered faces and young men with cautious eyes. They carried him on a makeshift litter of bamboo and woven leaves. They took him to their village, a collection of 10 nipa huts so deep in the mountains it did not appear on any Japanese map. It was called Barrio Esperanza, the Village of Hope. This was the first link in the chain. The risk was absolute. A captured airman meant death for the pilot. It meant something far worse for the villagers. The Kempeitai, the Japanese secret police, were not soldiers. They were specialists in terror. Their methods were precise, scientific. A rumor of a hidden American would bring them. They would arrive at dawn, quietly. They would surround the village. The questions would begin. Then the beatings. Then the fire. They burned the village of San Roque on the island of Cebu. Every hut, every man, woman, and child. The official Japanese report stated the village was destroyed for harboring insurgents. The whispers in the jungle told a different story. They had hidden a single American Navy pilot for 2 nights. Just 2 nights. The people of Barrio Esperanza knew this. They had heard the stories. Stories carried on the bamboo telegraph. Yet they took Lieutenant Foster in. They hid him in the rafters of a hut, beneath a pile of dried thatch. When a Japanese patrol passed nearby, a woman began to wail, faking a cholera death to keep them away. They fed him from their own meager stores. One more mouth to feed, one more life to protect. Food, medicine, information, a place to sleep. It was their contribution, their defiance. Maria Santos, 67 years old, the village elder, explained it in a post-war interview. A brittle audio recording in a dusty archive? Her voice thin as paper. He fell from the sky, she said. Our brother, our friend. The Americans were our friends. We could not let the enemy have him. It is our way. Patriotism, solidarity. An unshakable belief in a promise made years before by a tall American general. I shall return. For 3 weeks, Foster remained in Barrio Esperanza. His wounds healed. He learned a few words of the local dialect. He watched the silent, efficient courage of the people who had saved him. Then one night, a new man appeared in the village. A runner. He carried a message for the American. It was time to move. The guerrillas wanted him. In the declassified MISX files folder 734B, there is a map. A hand-drawn map of Panay stained with sweat and dirt, recovered from a guerrilla courier. It shows the island crisscrossed with secret trails. Symbols mark Japanese garrisons, patrol routes, and airfields. Other symbols mark safe houses, supply caches, and guerrilla camps. This was the blueprint of the bamboo telegraph. This was the secret geography of resistance. The map shows zones of control: red for the Japanese, green for the guerrillas. Panay was an ocean of green with small, isolated islands of red. The guerrillas of Panay were led by Colonel Macario Peralta Jr., a brilliant U.S.-trained officer who refused to surrender. From his headquarters deep in the mountains, Peralta commanded the 61st Infantry Division, an army of ghosts. They struck Japanese patrols, gathered intelligence, and ran the shadow government that truly controlled the island. And they collected downed Allied airmen. Foster's journey took a month. He was passed from one guide to another. A farmer named Jose, a fisherman named Ramon, a teenager named Ben. They traveled by night, through dense jungle, across rushing rivers, over sharp mountain ridges. They slept in caves, abandoned shacks, or sometimes just under the stars. They never used the same trail twice. Always moving, always silent. Twice they were almost caught. Once by a Japanese patrol, forcing them to lie submerged in a swamp for 4 hours, breathing through hollow reeds. Another time, a collaborator, a Filipino loyal to the Japanese, saw them. He ran to inform the nearest garrison. He never made it. A man with a bolo stepped out of the jungle, a swift, silent motion. The collaborator fell. The bamboo telegraph had its own justice system. Swift, final. Foster was not alone. The reports list others. Lieutenant William Hawkins, P-40 pilot, hidden in a church bell tower in Negros for 6 months. Ensign Charles Miller, TBF Avenger gunner, cared for by the Bajau Sea Gypsies of the Sulu Archipelago. Sergeant Frank Peterson, B-24 waist gunner, disguised as a native and living in a Mangjan village on Mindoro. Anderson, Baker, Clark, Davis, Edwards, Flynn, an alphabet of saved men. They were being collected. For what, nobody knew. Not the villagers, not the low-level guerrillas. Maybe Peralta knew, maybe his command staff. The airmen were moved from camp to camp, slowly making their way to clandestine collection points along the coast. They were more than just saved men. They were assets. They were information. They were skilled pilots and gunners the Allied war machine desperately needed back. And somewhere, in the strategic silence of a command bunker in Australia, a plan was taking shape. A plan involving these men. The whispers on the salt wind spoke of a final destination, a secret rendezvous, Palawan, maybe Tawi-Tawi, maybe a submarine. The final link in the chain, the most dangerous of all. August 10th, 1944, Brisbane, Australia. The files were empty. That's the first thing you notice. Not entirely empty, but empty where it mattered. The thick manila folders, stamped secret and bearing the crest of the Netherlands Forces Intelligence Service, bulged with reports on Japanese troop movements, coastal defenses, and the morale of the Formosan labor battalions sweating on the Pateau airstrip. Everything was there, in triplicate. Everything but the people who mattered most. The ghosts. The Dutch were meticulous. They had been for 300 years. Their reports, translated for the Allied command, detailed the cooperation of the local populace on Morotai. They had names: Ambo, a village headman from Buho Buho, a man named Sarman from a Toblerese clan near the Gotalalamo River. These men and others like them, though technically subjects of a distant queen in exile, were now assets for General MacArthur. They guided the Alamo Scouts. They led Australian Z Special Unit patrols through jungle that could swallow a man whole in 20 feet. They pointed out Japanese machine gun nest with a subtle nod, a flick of the eyes. They knew the trails, the secret trails. The trails the Japanese maps never showed. The evidence was there. In NEFIS Report A1138, it stated plainly, "Indigenous guides are proving invaluable. Their knowledge of the interior is absolute, and their animosity toward the occupying force is a significant tactical advantage." Invaluable, absolute, advantage. Strong words for a dry report. In one folder, a series of charcoal sketches, rough but alive, tucked inside a report on patrol routes. unsigned. Maybe by a corporal from Texas with a hidden talent. Maybe by an intelligence officer trying to make the terrain real for men who had only ever seen cornfields. One sketch showed two huge Americans, rifles held low, sweating through their fatigues, and a small, wiry man in front, barefoot, a parang at his hip, pointing. His face was a mask of concentration. He was a Sangiovese guide, or maybe Galelaris. The sketch didn't say, it didn't need to. He was the key. He was the difference between a successful patrol and a line of names on a memorial wall. Another sketch, a lean-to, almost invisible against a curtain of strangler figs and giant ferns. A jungle hideout. Smoke from a tiny, smokeless fire curled into the dense canopy. It was a place a man could disappear, a place a man could be hidden. But look for one thing, and the paper trail goes cold. Ice cold. Look for any mention of the Filipino village. Look for any record of a rescued American pilot. Nothing, not a word. Not a whisper on paper. The Nephis files documented every tribe, every headman, every rumor of a Japanese supply dump. But of the small community of Filipino fishermen and traders living on the remote northern coast, there was only silence. A perfect, deafening silence. And that silence is where the truth begins. Morotai was not an island. It was a fortress built by geology, a spine of volcanic rock running north to south, cloaked in a suffocating green blanket of jungle. The Japanese held the coastlines, the flatlands, the places where an airfield could be carved out of the coral and earth. The interior, however, was a different world, a world they did not control, a world they barely entered. The reports of Colonel Kenji Tanaka, commander of the 2nd Provisional Raiding Unit, confirm this. His maps showed elevations, rivers, coastlines. They did not show the loyalty of a village headman in the Godalalamo River Valley. They did not show the hidden footpaths, worn smooth over centuries. His concern was the Pito airstrip, the Doreba beachhead, the American PT boats that nipped at his supply lines like saltwater crocodiles. He worried about destroyers. He worried about bombers. He did not worry about a few fishermen in a hidden cove. He did not have the manpower. He did not have the time. The Japanese strategy was a hard shell, a perimeter defense. Confront the enemy at the water's edge. Fight him on the airfields. The deep interior, with its ravines and fevers, was left to itself. A perfect place to hide someone. A perfect environment for secrets. The Filipino villagers were different. They were not indigenous to Morotai, they were outsiders. Fishermen from Mindanao, traders from the Sulu archipelago, families who had fled Spanish priests or American governors or Japanese invaders. They lived on the margins. In the coves, the Dutch charts missed. On the hillsides, the Japanese patrols ignored. They were ghosts before the war even began. No land deeds, no tax records, no official existence. They existed in the gaps in the maps, the gaps in the administration, the gaps in the war. And a downed American pilot, falling from the sky in a plume of smoke, would be the ultimate outsider. A man who had fallen into the gaps with them. There are no documents, no official commendations for a Filipino fisherman named Miguel, or a woman named Elena for hiding Lieutenant Jack Riley. There are no records, no names, no locations. The Allied intelligence officers who debriefed rescued airmen focused on military intelligence, enemy positions, anti-aircraft capabilities. They did not ask about the faces of the people who fed them, who moved them by night from one hut to the next, who spoke to them in a mixture of broken English and Tagalog. That was not tactically relevant. That was just survival. Maybe the records never existed. A secret kept by men who knew secrets were best kept in the heart, not on a page. A favor done for a man who fell from the heavens, a debt that would never be recorded or repaid. A perfect blank space. A silence so complete it screamed. A scream you can only hear if you press your ear to the folders, if you look past the official reports and the neat charcoal sketches, if you search for the evidence of the absence. And then you find it. buried deep in a file labeled Miscellaneous Intercepts, Sector 7th. Not a report, not a memo, a single sheet of paper, a typed transcript of a garbled radio intercept from a Coastwatcher network, dated September 19th, 1944. Just one line of deciphered text. The bird is in the coconut grove. It meant nothing. It could have been anything. A code for a supply drop, a planned rendezvous, a piece of disinformation. It was slated for discard, but at the bottom of the page, a hasty annotation in blue ink, written by some anonymous intelligence clerk in a sweltering tent in Hollandia. A thought he almost didn't have. A single word. Filipino. August 10th, 1944. Brisbane, Australia. The files were empty. That's the first thing you notice. Not entirely empty, but empty where it mattered. The thick manila folders, stamped secret in a faded red ink, held transit manifests, supply requisitions, morning reports from squadrons that no longer existed. They held the ghosts of paperwork. But the incident reports for downed airmen, the after-action summaries from search and rescue, the debriefings from recovered crew, they were gone. Or they were never there at all. The folder for Lieutenant Jack Riley was thin. A single page. A transfer order. A name on a list. That was all. Missing. Presumed lost. A bureaucratic shrug. The official story was silence. But history is never silent. It just learns to whisper. You find the real stories far from the filing cabinets of Brisbane, far from the polished desks of command. You find them in the Philippines, in the highlands of Luzon, the jungles of Mindanao, the small coastal barrios of Leyte. Here, the archives are not made of paper. They are made of people. Grandmothers with eyes like clouded glass, old men whose hands are maps of a lifetime of work. Their memories are the missing files. The real files. Take the story of Lieutenant C.W. Walt Miller, shot down over Negros in February 1944. Official record, MIA. End of story. But not in the village of Barangay Santa Cruz. There they tell it differently. They say he fell from the sky like a wounded star. A local farmer, a man named Thomas, found him in a sugarcane field, his leg shattered. Thomas, his wife Maria, their 3 children. They knew the penalty for harboring an American. A slow death. A public death. They hid him anyway. For 6 months, Miller lived in a pit dug beneath their nipa hut. He learned their words. He ate their food. He became their secret. Hiding, feeding, tending, lying. The daily sacraments of civilian courage. Every Japanese patrol that passed the village was a held breath. A child's cough in the night could mean discovery. A strange smell from the cooking pot. A dog barking at the wrong time. The entire village became a conspiracy of silence, a fortress built of whispers and averted gazes. They were not soldiers. They were farmers, fishermen, weavers, mothers. People with everything to lose. And they risked it all for a stranger who fell from the sky. This is not in any file in Brisbane or Washington, but it is painted on a mural on the wall of the village school in Santa Cruz. A tall, pale man surrounded by dozens of small brown figures. Their hands are on his shoulders, his arms, holding him up, protecting him. A testament. This is the human legacy, the unwritten codicil of war. And if it happened in the Philippines with such fierce, undocumented loyalty, why not elsewhere? Why not on the islands dotting the Molucca Sea? The ones that were just names on a map to the men flying over them. Morotai, Halmahera, Rao, Ternate. Places where the official war was a bombing run, a naval bombardment, a beach landing. A brief, violent paragraph in a thick history book. But the war for the people living there was different. It was the plains overhead, the strange wreckage in the jungle, the bodies washing ashore, and the men who survived, the men who fell from the clouds. The whispers must exist there too. You can almost hear them. carried on the monsoon winds from island to island. Stories told by fishermen mending their nets, of a ghost they pulled from the water, pale and shivering, speaking a language of clicks and growls. Stories from old women in the sago palm groves, of a boy with eyes the color of the sky they fed and hid in a sea cave until his people came back. These stories are not in a file. They have no serial number. They are folklore. They are rumors. They are truth. The official search for Lieutenant Jack Riley ended a week after he disappeared. The paperwork was filed. The telegram was sent. But what if the real search is only beginning? What if the clues are not in military archives, but in the lullabies sung to children on Moritai, in the patterns woven into ceremonial cloths on Halmahera? Perhaps an artist in a village on the coast of Galela sketched a strange face in charcoal on a piece of bark. The face of a pilot. A boy from Kansas City. A story passed down, father to son, mother to daughter, a sacred inheritance. The files in Brisbane are a dead end, cold and sterile. They tell you what the military lost, a plane, an asset, a number. They don't tell you what the people found, a human being, a responsibility, a chance to show grace in a world gone mad. The search for paper is over. The search for memory, for folklore, for the echoes of bravery in the quiet places of the world, that has just begun. The map is not on paper. The map is in the stories. And the only way to read it is to go there and listen. What is the true ledger of war? Is it found in the neat columns of the dead and the missing, or in the unwritten debts of the living? The thick manila folders, stamped "Secret" in a faded red ink, tell one story. They speak of burning metal, of transit manifest for squadrons that no longer exist. They meticulously chart the coordinates of wreckage, a plume of black smoke against an indifferent blue sky. But these archives are silent on the currency that truly mattered on those islands. They do not record the value of a shared meal of fish and rice when starvation was a constant shadow. They have no entry for the fisherman who guided his small banca through treacherous waters at night, a phantom moving between Japanese patrols. They offer no annex on the courage of a young girl who stood watch at the edge of the village, her childhood game of hide-and-seek turned into a deadly reality. The files speak of assets and intelligence. They do not speak of humanity. This was a different kind of combat, a quiet war fought in the spaces between lines on a map. It was a conspiracy of compassion, a battle waged not with bayonets but with hidden floorboards, not with radio signals but with a shared glance across a dusty path, not for strategic advantage but for the sanctity of a single human life. Every villager became a soldier in this unspoken army, every hut a fortress. Every lie told to a suspicious patrol leader was an act of defiance, a quiet victory in a war that would never be documented. It was an act of treason against an occupying empire. It was an act of profound faith in something older and more powerful than any nation. The pilots fell from the sky as warriors. They were instruments of a vast industrial war machine, trained to navigate by stars and instruments, to deliver destruction from a distance. On the ground, they became something else entirely. They became helpless. They became burdens. They became sons. Sheltered by people who navigated only by the tides and the seasons, who knew the earth not as a target, but as a provider. They came as agents of fire. They were hidden like the embers of a precious communal hearth. They arrived as soldiers. They left as witnesses to a grace they never expected. Decades have passed since the last pilot was smuggled to safety. The manila folders now sit in climate-controlled archives, their secrets declassified but their truths still obscured. The story is not in the brittle yellowed paper. It lives in the silences, in the gaps between the official reports. It survives in the half-remembered tales passed down to grandchildren, stories that lose a little more detail with each telling. The real memorials are not cast in bronze or carved in stone. They are the rustling of the palms that once hid a fugitive. They are the shorelines that welcomed clandestine submarines. They are the unspoken understanding in the eyes of the descendants of the saved and the descendants of the saviors. History forgets the names, The earth remembers the debt.